Welcome to AI in the Enterprise. It's an online series of enterprise-focused talks with leaders in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and business. I'm Doug Levin, as Jennifer indicated. I'm an executive in residence in El-Geish at Harvard. I'm an entrepreneur, technologist, and general advisor to startups. I've been in the industry for around 30 years. And over the course of time, I've encountered AI in various forms. And today, I think we're going to be treated to a discussion about AI in the enterprise as it's seen from the eyes of someone who is very key in this area and working at Cisco. AI in the enterprise aims to provide key insights into how enterprises are thinking critically and strategically about AI projects. Successful adoption programs need to be developed to fit the particular needs of each organization, from its data strategy, project management, product management and development, to its engagement in the cloud with customers and with partners. The goal is to equip today's executives and senior decision makers with strategies and tools that they need to implement successful transitions to AI in larger, more established organizations. Today's discussion will focus on AI and the customer experience. But before we begin, there are a couple of housekeeping items we have for you. First, please mute your microphones during the talk. You should currently be muted, but if not, please do so now. You can submit your questions by typing them into the chat facility you find in Zoom. During our talk, we will select some of your questions and ask them of Mohamed, our guest. You should know that we are recording this session both as video and later as a podcast, and they will appear on El-Geish's YouTube channel, as well as iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and other podcast platforms. After the event, you can continue this conversation on our Slack channel, which is called AI in the Enterprise Slack Community. And you'll find there materials mentioned in this talk, such as slides and articles, a registration link for our next AI in the Enterprise event. By the way, that's a note, don't miss this one. It's going to involve Ali Miller, who is the global head of machine learning, business development, startups, and VC at Amazon Web Services. This talk will happen on Wednesday, March 24th at 11 a.m. to noon. You will also find on the Slack channel insightful articles and helpful resources. If you have not already joined, you can find a link in the chat. So, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce today's guest, Mohamed El-Geish. He is Director of AI for Cisco's Contact Center Solutions. And he was the co-founder and chief architect at Vocia, when he worked on automatic speech recognition, NLM, and developed the company's AI assistant. Cisco eventually bought his company in 2019, and that brings him to Cisco. Earlier in his career, he worked at LinkedIn and Microsoft. Mohamed also co-authored a book called Computing with Data, and served as a teaching assistant at Stanford, you know, that school on the other coast, for machine learning and deep learning courses. Very happy to welcome Mohamed to AI in the Enterprise.
Thank you for having me.
There he is with that picture of that school on the East Coast right behind him.
Yeah, the snow here is, of course, every day.
Okay. Well, he's Mohamed is sitting in San Jose now in Northern California, so he's probably enjoying better weather than we are. So Mohamed, you have a couple of slides you want to take. You want to cover?
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about AI in general, right? Like how AI is helping us today change the way we develop software. And I want to set maybe some example if you are imagining in the future. Your AI can be helping you with like mundane tasks that you do day to day that you don't enjoy doing today. For example, having an appointment scheduled for you, right? Well, it turns out that this is actually not in the future. We had this at Voicea, where you and I in a meeting like this one, I can say, okay, Eva, schedule a meeting with Doug on Tuesday at 5, and it just happens right there and then, right? So your follow-ups, your action items, all of these things just are collected and indexed, and they're at the tips of your fingers whenever you want to have access to them. You can follow through with your team. You can have a space or channel with your team where all of these things are disseminated and they have access to it. So it's really about having a lot of information in the enterprise, the workflows that could be democratized and accessed at any point, but also at the time you actually are talking over text or speech, these things are usually lost, but we want to have access to them after the fact so you can follow up and you have more productive days at work. Now, there's a paradigm, right, called software 2.0. Andrej Karpathy at Tesla coined that term, and I like it a lot. That's why I'm going to use it a lot today. The idea is like software 2.0 is eating up software 1.0, the way we've been doing traditional software, right? So if you think of like what do we do day to day, before software even, you had a lot of maybe notes and other things that you have to like crunch, and like maybe you're solving a problem in math and statistics, you have a lookup table, right? I'm not sure if people remember these lookup tables we used to have in tests. So you go and do these things by hand. And then software 1.0 enabled you to automate that. You start with some input data or any input. Could be images, could be any sort of data that you imagine. And you want to reach a decision or an output. And there's transformation in between. There's some processing that happens in between. The way we have been doing this in software 1.0 is basically saying to the computer, like, here are the instructions. Very clear instructions, right? Deterministic. They have all the rules in them, and the computer knows how to like interpret that or execute your instructions. Now, the challenge with this is not everything is easy to like write down, right, as a instruction manual. Imagine if I, for some reason, wanted like to learn tennis, right? And I asked you like, hey, can you write me like the instructions of how to get a spin or how to hit the ball effectively? You could tell me something like, okay, here are the rules of the game, and you describe all the rules. The rules are describable, right? They're transfer knowledge. But then the way you actually hit that, you know, backhand, or the way you like you brush the ball, that's more like a tacit kind of thing, right? It's tacit knowledge. Imagine just the complexity of describing that in detail so that a human can actually follow the instructions, let alone a computer. That's where software 2.0 comes in. This is where AI actually shines in looking at so many examples, just like what you would do, like, you know, with a coach or a trainer, you would see your friend playing tennis and you would see like how it's done. And then you absorb that tacit knowledge the same way like software 2.0 is enabling us today to do things that were not possible before or were not as good before. So now AI is able to do these things effectively and enabling new opportunities for software to come in and like help with these scenarios.
So do you have some tangible examples of, for example, the automation benefits of software 2.0?
Yeah, let's move to the next slide and we can see one of the examples we have is IVR. So imagine automating all of these things that you have to do today on the phone. And this is, of course, part of what we do at the contact center. You call your bank and you ask, hey, I want to get my balance check, for example. You might face today like a lot of menus. So you have to press 3 for that, and then press like another button for like which account type and so on. You're instructing the machine, right, down this like tree of options to get to the bottom of what you want to execute or what you want to actually know. But what if we can use natural language to automate this process? So you just talk to the machine the same way you talk to another human. You say like, I want to see like how much money I have in my account, right? And if there's missing information the machine cannot determine, it will ask you, or the AI will ask you like, well, which account? You have savings account, you have a checking account. Or you can just say the whole thing in one shot and the machine knows exactly what to do. In this case, I think we were tied down in the human computer interaction, HCI, to what the technology affords to do, what the technology is capable of doing. That's why in the beginning we had computers with the terminals. You actually just type commands. There's no mouse, there's no graphical user interface. And then once the technology caught up and was capable enough to actually enable you to like point and click and drag, you got another paradigm at the fingertips, right, of your hands. And then you figure out like, how can I increase that paradigm or do a paradigm shift to something more useful and more usable from a user experience and human interaction with the computers. And it really just follows naturally that I want to speak to a computer, just like I speak to you right now, or I want to, maybe listen to what the computer has to say, or have a video recognition system that understands what I'm doing by vision. So all of these things, like the perceptual tasks, are now possible because of AI.
So when enterprises come to Cisco and they have and Cisco offers many networking solutions, what's the next logical step that enables them to, for example, ask for an IVR solution or another type of automated or AI-driven solution from Cisco?
There are a lot of cases where AI can streamline processes and help with customer satisfaction, improve the customer experience, and of course, also be more efficient and save costs, especially when there's like a spike and you cannot fulfill the demand as fast as possible, right? So imagine the customer experience when there's a spike in number of calls coming in through that system, the phone lines, and you might have to wait for hours, or you cannot actually get the service that day because who can wait that long? And the idea here is to make it possible to get AI to do this work, to augment the human workforce, to help with the cases where it's easy for AI to grasp, it's easy for the AI to provide value. And this actually is applicable in so many applications and so many solutions Cisco offers today. I'm just gonna maybe give a few examples top of mind, off the cuff. Of course, the contact center one we just talked about. We also assist agents during the call. AI will listen on the call. It has access to a well-indexed, searchable knowledge base that we build from a plethora of documents and websites that the customer provides. And then we have the AI helping the agent in real time. Basically, the AI will be listening on, sidecar, or we call them sidekick because we like to think of our call center agents as super agents with AI. So you have a sidekick. It just raises its hand and says like, I have an answer for you. I have a recommendation. Here's something you could do in this situation, like a question about lost and found, right? Oh, I know exactly what to say. Here are the instructions you should follow to go get the thing that you lost. So this allows the agent to really focus on the conversation, the human connection, right? Which is really big. And I think we need to talk about that, how to get the AI to emote and respond emotionally with empathy. But we still need humans to do that. And for sure, we still have this human connection. It's not going to go anytime soon anywhere. I think it's one of the biggest things that we have to like keep in that sector or that service, that you are a human being at the end of the day. There's a lot of emotions involved in such situations, and focusing on the conversation and actively listening to either, in a one-on-one conversation or a meeting or customer call is super important. So focusing on the conversation, understanding, and really like getting to the bottom of topics. And sometimes the agents have a lot of training beforehand. This will allow us to shorten the training time so they can go and help with certain topics right away. Like, we had a lot of topics emerging last year or the year before, like COVID, and that required a lot of help from AI to augment the workforce. Of course, I have to mention a few other topics or products and services we have. For example, the Webex Assistant, which is basically the continuation of Voicea and Webex. In a meeting like this, if you use the Webex meeting platform, you would get closed captioning, you would get actions and highlights and notes taken for you, and you can review the transcript later on. We have also some other AI uses in networking and other services Cisco offers.
But ultimately, the goal is to create an AI that is indistinguishable from a human, so that somebody might call in to a company during the Super Bowl and ask about a product that they saw in a commercial, and that AI could answer during a very heavy period of inquiries, and basically be indistinguishable from a person sitting in a call center in Kansas or another call center. Is that really the objective?
So I would say that it's, first of all, like very, very, very hard, extremely hard, given our current technology to do this. It's closing up to like what we call AGI, artificial general intelligence. We're not going to see this anytime soon. Maybe not in our lifetimes, in my calculations. I might be wrong. However, I think there's an objective here, which is really important, that, well, humans cannot staff, or technically they can staff this system or staff the contact center up to the maximum capacity or the required capacity for the spike in calls that you will see, and do this 24/7. And also have the capacity on, like the intellectual resilience to keep answering repeated questions and mundane questions that they don't want to do either way. Like the human will not actually in this case be satisfied with the job, because a lot of the questions are repeatable and a lot of them are mundane asks. So some of the questions could be as simple as like, what's the fax number I should file the claim to? For some reason, certain companies still use fax, but the idea is that, okay, well, this is something the machine can answer quickly. Or the banking example I answered before, there's no need for a human to be in the loop in this case, but I think the human still needs to be in the loop for a lot of cases where it's a more cognitively demanding ask. And a lot of the interesting anecdotes we've heard before about like catching that exceptional case and really reacting to it in a way that is appropriate. A human can pick on that. So there's an anecdote that it's maybe an urban legend, maybe half true. So I'm going to mention it quickly, but with a caveat of like, take it with a grain of salt. GM, I think back in the day where I don't want to like say the 60s, but it could be in the 60s. One of the cars they developed had an issue, and one of the calls that they got was like, hey, when I go and get ice cream, if I order vanilla, the car doesn't start when I get back to the car. If I order any other flavor, it just works. And of course, like an AI might not pick on that signal. Like it will just be out of domain, as we say, and it might be neglected. And it might be like, okay, well, I don't have anything in my bank of knowledge to answer this, So it will definitely escalate to a human. And a very wise agent will actually dig deeper to see like, this sounds interesting, right? And you want to see like what's going on. And according to the story, they followed up with this person and they dispatched an engineer, and they really went there, got the ice cream, tried it. They got the vanilla flavor the first time, the car did not start. They got like mango the other time, the car started, and they repeated this. This is the scientific method, right? Like you want to see if you repeat the experiment multiple times, how the results are, assuming the experiment setup is correct. Well, it turned out that the vanilla flavor is ready to go. It's like ready made and available for you to quickly take it and go back. And there's something about vapor in the car, the engine, that caused it to like almost like lock down if it's still too hot. So to actually go the extra mile and do this, I'm not sure if the AI as it stands today is capable of doing this. In addition to the idea of like having a lot of mundane tasks that the humans do not want to do anymore. It's not really that fun.
What's your view of Alexa?
I have Alexa, I use it. I think of personal assistants as the extension of our capabilities in the human sense, or our physical extensions in the cyber ether. The way I can think of an analogy here is like transportation, right? You go into your car and it's an extension for mobility, right? You go into like an airplane and now it's an extension for even further mobility. I think of the assistants the same way. Like I can actually dispatch Alexa or Google Home to do something for me, and it just happens. Automation.
And do you think that Alexa has a place in the office of the future?
Well, we have our own, I would say, like vision around this as well. So I'll talk about the WebEx assistant vision a little bit. And I think absolutely, yes. AI has a lot of spaces to conquer and help out with in the enterprise, in the office space, the future of work. So if you think of like the continuation of what we're doing now with like voice assistants in a meeting, this could continue to be beyond the meeting, beyond the communal use case. It's more about like, how can you differentiate between what dog wants and then continue doing that, basically having a lot of things automated for you. And when you need it, it's just at the tips of your fingers. Same thing, by the way, with Cortana. I think that was the vision for Cortana in the beginning, the notebook concept, right? So if you have a Windows PC, there's a personal assistant embedded into it, and it knows about your notebooks, it knows about your meetings, it knows about your schedule and emails and all of these things. So why can't AI help us understand what to do next to be more efficient, right? What can we do in these spaces is actually, I think it's currently like limited by a few things. The first thing is there's a novelty aspect to it, and that's about building trust. Do I trust this system to actually understand my kind of profile about what I'm doing? And I think this is inevitable with, like email, for example. Let's take this, it's a great example, an analogy. A lot of enterprises were kind of skeptic about like, hey, I don't trust you with my data in the cloud. I want to host my own email service on premise. So I'm really happy just download the Exchange on my servers, managing this like behind a kind of ironclad curtain, and nobody has access to it except for our organization. But then with building this kind of trust with public clouds, I think now in the most cases there's almost like no-brainer kind of decision-making process. Yeah, well, I'm going to use the cloud for hosting my email, data for computation, and so on. It's about building that trust, but now because AI needs to learn more about your data, not just like keep it in the safe and like lock it and encrypted, we call it encryption at rest. So you can keep your encryption key and nobody has access to it on the other side. There's a lot of research that's being done today in how to train. Remember the tennis examples? Well, what if I did not show you tennis per se, but I showed you like somebody else playing tennis instead of me, and it's not tennis, it's maybe squash or other like racquetball, sports. So you don't know enough to actually make, interesting conclusions about me individually. Like per se, I don't know if this is Mohamed playing tennis at this time, and a lot of what we call personally identifiable information, PII, would be stripped away from this. And now it's just another example. And this is also doable, guess what? Using AI to synthesize such data and learn from it. So a more sophisticated AI model can actually generate that for other applications to learn from. So that's one thing, that trust is important. And the second one is just capability of like linking all of these systems together. Today, it's fragmented. A lot of things are fragmented experiences. You get your notes maybe in Evernote and your calendar on Outlook and your meetings on WebEx, and there's not one single place where these things are all connected. And that's why I think a lot of the, I would say, visionary way of thinking about AI, that it has to actually learn from natural interactions like natural language and vision and so on, so that these systems, when they have their own AI, they talk actually through human media. Think of that actually as automation for automation, meaning think of the IVR use case we talked about earlier. So there's an AI, there's some machine learning system listening in and talking to you. But what if the caller is also an assistant? It's actually listening to what the IVR is saying and responding to it.
Okay.
So back to your, yeah.
So
back to your,
I mean, I think that's really interesting stuff. We have to continue on that, but a quick question from Jose. Beyond trust, what are some of the other challenges in adopting new AI solutions in call centers?
That's a good question. The challenges have to do with the sensitivity and determinism of the current systems. Imagine if you're dealing with, like, a rover you're sending to Mars. You do a lot of testing, you do a lot of scrutiny to make sure that everything just works perfectly. There's a lot of verification included in that. And you can go, and think of like medical devices, and then certain cases, the stakes are too high. You have to spend a lot of time understanding the entire range of scenarios and figure out like what to do in each of these cases. So I think it depends on where you are in your kind of adoption of technology and transformation, and understanding like the limitations of AI today, right? So like, where does it actually provide a lot of value from the baseline that you have today versus something that you can, I would say like sprinkle it like pixie dust and like you expect it to work. A lot of awareness and I would say education is required to understand, okay, where is the ceiling of what the AI can provide today? And I highly recommend a phased deployment approach for these things. See how it can actually solve the easy problems first and increase that value metric over the baseline. So get your metric very well defined, which in a lot of cases in contact center, this is how, like, I would say the vast majority of contact centers operate. There are a set of KPIs that are well defined, and you can see right away value attribution where you're doing A/B testing. So you get no AI in group A and AI in group B, and you can see the difference right away in these metrics. So showing that value and just phase the deployment, understand the limitations of AI, and work up that kind of adoption curve.
So Mohamed, we have talked before about the state of Illinois COVID application that deploys AI to help the residents impacted by COVID-19 and unemployment benefits. Could you give us a deeper insight into that application and some of the positive consequences of it?
Absolutely. So the state of Illinois had a huge spike early March. I'm going to give you the case study parameters. Early March to early May, we saw around 11.5x the number of calls. That's huge compared to the same period the year prior. The reason, of course, is the unfortunate, COVID-19. The phenomena, of course, was unprecedented, and we had a lot of ready to deploy fast deployment systems. So one of these systems were deployed with the partnership with Google CCAI, and the contact center from Cisco on that side of answering queries for employment benefits. I think the system overall helped around 1 million callers, and that was hundreds of thousands of them were helped by AI. So that was the call to get benefits, understand like, certain things operationally, like we talked about before, like checking balance and one of the queries for IVR, that's really good. Same thing with the password resetting and so on, changing records. The queries basically were estimated to be, I think 140,000 inquiries per day managed by AI. That's during the day, augmenting the existing human force, and around 40,000 after hours calls per night. The estimate in savings were around $100 million annually. So this is what happens. Like you actually not only like did all of these great savings, but you enabled people to get access to service very quickly compared to before when you only had a workforce that needs to be trained and like expanded, scaled up, and well staffed. The prior state was that you will be waiting for hours or not getting through. But with this kind of, by the way, also phased deployment, the first phase, I think the whole thing, all in all, like each deployment took around 2 weeks. So very fast response. The first phase was just answering frequently asked questions. And that's where AI can help significantly, because it's like text understanding. And you don't need to do an operation, what we call like fulfillment. And fulfillment is something that you do in basically the back end of your system, like business APIs. And the third thing was basically the second phase was the after hours deployment. So now you're augmenting kind of temporarily, like you're dealing with this like gap in the staffing number of hours. And then the third one was basically full-fledged deployment. You got complex inquiries handled, you got password reset, you got check claim status, you got change my record, and so on. And that's actually on the second slide that we talked about. So the case study is online, feel free to read it. I think it's a huge improvement using AI and just a great use in the time of need.
Great. Back to this Illinois case study. How long did it take to develop that application?
So the application, there were multiple partners involved, and they have reused some of the stuff that COVID FAQs were already pre-packaged. The CCI itself, the solution has been there for a while. I think the question is asking more about like, hey, how can I use that platform or that technology, the Cisco contact center, the CCI, and maybe some of the pre-packaged what we call like virtual agents. I think if you start today on any of these public solutions, you can get a decent result within a week for your testing, and then you can start refining it. And in maybe 3 to 4 weeks, you have something that is capable of answering a lot of questions, the FAQs at least, at scale.
And it seemed to have paid back in annual savings.
Absolutely. And just like helping people, that's really the goal here, is to get like to this scenario where something was not possible before, now it's possible. Or something that was really hard to do before, and now it's doable within minutes instead of like hours.
So there have been a couple of questions raised on the chat about security and IVR and call center and these kind of new call center applications. Could you kind of give a general scenario of the security related issues and any specific instances of how security can be applied to these AI applications?
Absolutely. So if you think about it, it depends on your deployment, right? The information that you're passing through the phone is going to be transcribed. And whether you're using something on premise, that's your basically span of control that you can harden the security for, or you're using a publicly available solution that you then integrate via API to your system, you need to make sure that this conduit is encrypted. You need to make sure that the policies that are in place are compatible with your compliance requirements. and infosec policies. So whether it's like encryption at rest, which is obviously like, I would say minimum requirement, making sure that there's no data collected or gathered or logged, if that's something that your application requires, and having a kind of scan for BII. There's some other like, things that people care about, like PCI compliance and so on. Like, you don't want to record the credit card number if it's during the call. So all of these things we have actually tools to scan for and make sure that they don't happen. And a lot of agents are from the get-go like trained to press like, basically a specific button to stop recording. But anyways, even if it, shows up somewhere, we can filter that out, and it's not going to be a challenge. It's not that different. I know there's a lot of like contention or challenges with like understanding the voice medium captures a lot more signals than the text medium. It's not that different from like, securing a website or securing a chatbot or securing a email system, right? The medium, I think, is secondary. It's about the policies and the ecosystem and the, I would say, maturity level of the system that is capable of doing that. And of course, at Cisco, we take this as like job number one. Having a secure system, enterprise grade, is the core foundation of what we do.
Okay. Let me ask you, are there ethical issues here? I mean, there are issues related to general AI, but if you could drill into the specific call related IVR kind of ethical issues, that would be, as a primer for the audience, that would be helpful.
Well, let's take a look at like how AI in general learns, because that's a good segue for like, how then we can tackle this very specific question. We mentioned earlier, like AI learns from examples. So imagine like a baby, an infant, and the brain is almost like, clean slate. And whatever you put in there, this is it. It doesn't have access to the, rest of the world, like kind of connected consciousness. It does not, transfer knowledge from other brains. So whatever you put in that brain is what its understanding of what happens in the world, right? And if you give a lot of examples from, I'm going to use like, statistics here, like a subpopulation, it will learn more about that subpopulation than other populations, for example. So that's why it's important to understand the domain of what you're dealing with and how to be addressing what we call like the long tail problem, right? Understanding in that distribution how to represent the underrepresented in a way that's fair and transparent. That's really the goal, is understanding like where are your limitations and what you're going to do about them, because learning from examples is by definition going to be limited. You're not going to be able to see everything. It's inductive, it's not deductive. You cannot prove it mathematically, right? You see a lot of examples and you see like how you can go and augment your way of thinking about the world by oversampling from this underrepresented population, for example. So imagine any, like IVR is maybe like, one example that applies here, but a lot of examples also apply. Anything that has to do with like understanding, like, let's say your way of speaking, right? I'm not gonna say that, a certain accent could be hard or not, but even if you think of individual ways of speaking, how can I learn like how this person pronounces their name to transcribe it correctly? My name, for example, is not in dictionaries. So how would the AI understand like that's my name? And that's something that you should be transcribing correctly. So what we do is it's incrementally learning by looking at its deficiencies, whether in automated or semi-automated fashion. And then we basically improve as we go. So just like as you grow, you learn more, AI is continuously improving. Or let me be more precise, the teams behind that AI strive to make it such like, continuously improving. It's almost like growing a tree. you need to keep an eye on it. You have to check for bugs. You have to check for snails and what have you, and like take care of it. It's not just a machine. Even machines you have to oil, right? But this one is actually more of an ecosystem. There's like a soil, sunlight, and water. A lot of ingredients go into it, and making sure that it's doing the right thing. It's growing correctly into the right directions I wanted to like optimize for this objective. But at the same time, maybe my objective is not so good. Like I need to revisit that, go back to like the whiteboard and revisit my objectives such that I'm addressing these ethical questions. And I know a lot of people make like some debates and some counterpoints about this, that it just reflects what is in the world out there. And I say to that, like, it might not be your fault, but it's your responsibility.
So the logical next step is, how do you measure business success and metrics in an AI environment, and especially relative to IVR?
Great question. So let me give you a general framework first, and then we can, again, like delve deeper into IVR. In my opinion, there are like 3 steps or 3 questions you gotta ask when you're thinking about technology in general and specifically AI. And maybe this is applicable to even more business, practices. The first question is, you have to have your business vision and goals very well defined. So you get like, your satisfying goals and your optimizing goals very, very clearly defined. That includes things like, we in the contact center business, monitor and check for our KPIs, let's say customer satisfaction, net promoter score, average handle time, first call resolution rate, which is basically like, if you count towards the FCR, it's basically the interactions that you were able to help the caller without putting them on hold, without forwarding, without saying, I'll call you back, or I'll ask my supervisor, and so on. So it's like a proxy for like satisfaction. So it's really about the experience in this case for IVR. But imagine a business where maybe it's a mix of like short-term revenue, customer retention, and CSAT. So if you got these metrics well understood and codified, and you have ways to measure them, now you can run experiments. You can run experiments with like the current baseline, right? That's your maybe non-existent system, or maybe it's your rule-based system, software 1.0. And you can introduce your AI system, the first iteration, and then kind of the baby grows, and then you have multiple iterations, and you can see like how you can make changes and test for these changes based on these metrics. So that's the first one. Figure out the metrics, codify them, keep monitoring. Second one is, how can I get fitting data? And I cannot emphasize enough here, it's about the fit of data, not just any data. And the example I like to like cite here is something like, you're gonna study for a history exam. I don't think it helps a lot to go and read German. It's not, like the German test right now. It's really about the exam. You're gonna go and like try to, optimize for the goal, which is scoring high on that test. Hopefully the goal is actually to learn, not just scoring high on the test. That's more important. So in my opinion, like, find how you can collect and understand data. So people use the word clean up data, but let's use the word understand, and like really get to the exploratory data analysis phase to get to see distributions and what's underrepresented, what's not, there, the unknown unknowns as much as you can. If you can, shrink them, would be great at this stage. Think of ramifications of your data choices. And then the third question is, okay, great. I have an initial set of objectives and I have an initial set of data. Now, after I deploy this the first time, how do I continually improve? How do I reiterate? How can I make sure that in the future, I'm really looking at the proper objectives and not just the thing we started with, without reacting to the world? Because it's not your fault. The world around you changes, but it's your responsibility to react to it. And it's very important that we have this continual loop. It's a virtuous circle of like understanding where the data is coming from initially and also continually, and then reacting to these, what we call like concept drifts or distribution shifts. And I like, somebody mentioned this, like Josh Tobin. I mentioned this from the perspective of like control theory. It's about the controllability of that system. So it's not just observability. You're actually able to go back and shift your way of like controlling the system and understanding what's happening in almost like real time. Like you want to act fast as well. So I hope this answered the question. These are the three things I would say, again, just for the benefit of a summary: understand the business KPIs and goals, have the data, the fitting data, and understand how we can collect the data and label it or annotate it correctly and understand the EDA. And then the third one is how to reiterate once you have an initial setup.
Looking to the future as the slide changes, could you give us an insight into what it's going to be like in 10, 15 years, in 20 years? It's interesting. I was watching, I was watching a science fiction show where all these aliens and all these different people are speaking different languages simultaneously. And it seems like that would be a healthy place to arrive at some point where you can have simultaneous translation and also support from an IVR simultaneously. Is that where we're going, or are we going to some other place?
So I say to this that to really learn or predict the future, you got to look at the past, right? So I can't remember the exact saying, but it's something like predictions are hard, especially about the future, right? And in a way that if you look at the trajectory of like where we were 50 years ago, 70 years ago with AI, and the rate of acceleration in three things in that recipe that I would cite. But look at that rate of acceleration, and then you maybe can predict about the future. And honestly, the goal is not to predict what's going to happen per se. It's just to spark conversations about like, here's the future we should shape. Here's what I want to think about so that I can maybe build a company around this, new space, new need. And I think of like the AI revolution as big of a role in increasing that pie, maybe as big as the introduction of commercial credit, right? So like you have $100, you put it in the bank, I go apply for a loan, and I get like, that $100, and then now they're like $200 in circulation, virtually basically. But like the idea, I can send it back to you, like, in terms of payment, and there's a lot more of like, that pie to go around. Same thing with AI, because like a lot of services, a lot of technologies we mentioned earlier were not possible before, and they now require a way of thinking about them that was not existing before. So I would see that pie increase. That's the first prediction I would say. Gartner had a study around the business value of AI in 2022. So that's not 10 years, next year. And it's a study from 2018. Yeah. So 2018, they predicted that the business value of AI is going to be around $3.9 trillion. Well, we have one more year to know how good of a prediction that is. But I agree that the directionality of that is absolutely very evident. The second thing is to mention in that study, guess what is the biggest thing that's going to eat up most of the pie? It's customer interaction and customer experience, CX. So for sure, it has a big role to play. And I think that human interaction is going to be a big piece, or the technologies we talked about, the perceptual tasks, vision, natural language understanding and natural language processing, and speech and text-to-speech and so on is going to be a big piece of the pie. Now, back to the three things I mentioned that are moving very fast since the 50s, and we see the trajectory and rate of acceleration growing through the roof. You got hardware, the compute power, and you got data, or digitizing data faster than we ever imagined before, especially with the advent of social media. And I was just saying before, like, maybe in that lockdown, we had way more digitization than we have ever seen at that scale before. And then this is going to continue. It's not going to stop. And then the third one is research algorithms, people thinking about ideas to make use of these prior two things. This has also been seeing a lot of interest in new ideas, paradigms, but a lot of funding as well being spent there, which accelerates, of course, these like studies and research areas. So with that said, I think whether it's enabling new scenarios or coming up with like the babblefish from the Hitchhiker's Road Through the Galaxy, or the famous like book and movie. So I think that is an interesting paradigm to think about, like what is it that can be done with AI. There's maybe a rule of thumb that if something can be done within a second, AI will automate. These are the kind of fast brain, knee-jerk reactions for certain tasks that do not require meditative thought or cognitive, load. But if you imagine of like the psychologists call it like system 1 and system 2 in the way of thinking. The system 1 tasks, I think we're going to be able to like solve most of them. System 2, the way that you think, it's in that book, Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. These will take a little bit longer because abstractions are not something that AI can like get right away. It needs to see a lot more of examples than, let's say, a human infant or toddler. So if you see like a couple of dogs and you can generalize that to like the concept of dog, that's an abstraction. AI is not there yet. And a lot of researchers are actually tackling this specific domain of research, which is like, how can we learn from few examples? It has implications not just on saving power, saving compute, saving electricity. By the way, this is a very costly thing that we are doing today. So we need to scale it to a way that's efficient and requires less compute and fewer number of examples, but also has implications on security and privacy. So if you need very few examples, maybe it's sufficient to know of like the data that you already collected. Maybe the user volunteered a smaller set and you can actually learn from that. And also there's something about the adaptation of AI. Once we talk about like, a specific domain, to leave that domain and apply the same building block that you just learned into this new domain, it's not as transferable today. It's really hard actually to like do this in certain jumps between domains. We call it like out domain learning. So out of domain applications of AI hopefully are also going to improve, so that you can think of AI similarly to like how you thought of software, where if I give you a library or a building block that handles something, let's say, something as simple as like calculating the cosine, of an angle or something like that, it's repeatable, it's reusable, right? For the most part, like you don't have to, you worry about a few things, but you don't have to worry, about like the validity of it to some extent. Maybe you have to worry about the programming language, the input domain of that function, and so on. Like, are you still in the Euclidean space if you're doing some like, Euclidean distances, or you move to like a spherical space or something like that? So the idea is like there's some preconditions that have to be applied, but then AI is not transferable as much as we'd like. So overall economy, I think the pie is going to be greater. First order effects, services and AI hardware and software is going to be in demand more and more, but also like second order effects, like what about the legal aspects? What about go-to-market of these things? How do you get to like, to new jobs that were not possible before? Think about it, like 10 years ago, we didn't hear about something like social media manager. That's a new job. Now it's existent because of the advent of like this new technology. And I think a lot of new jobs are going to be created in that space. And then you're going to see a lot of acceleration in research, digitization, and compute overall that will allow us to have pervasive experiences. AI is going to be almost just ubiquitous around you in an immersive way, and you will get to interact with machines to do the mundane things and maybe some of the system 1 things, and hopefully some of the system 2 things as well.
Okay. Mohamed, you read in the news a lot about these breakthrough AI projects coming from China and Japan and parts of Europe and other places. Do you, from your perch at Stanford and at Cisco and your experience with Microsoft and LinkedIn, do you think the US is maintaining its competitiveness?
I'm not in a position to make a overall, like, proper judgment. I will give you my very narrow point of view from my anecdotal experience, which is we've seen, especially in the past 4 years, a lot of concerns about the talent coming into the US. There's been a study where you can see like PhDs and masters, programs, and the decline is happening because of fear of immigration continuity. And I'm hopeful that this is turning around today.
Okay. Any final thoughts about the future of AI with respect to voice communications and call centers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think overall, what I would ask people to think about is think of the problems you have today in your domain. And again, like let's generalize a little bit in the enterprise. How can AI help you? How can you get to a place where you can automate some of the mundane tasks that are no fun? And think of like new possible scenarios that were out of reach before. The AI can come in and help you like automate some of the workflows. Think of the democratization of tribal knowledge. Maybe like you're in a meeting and you thought like, oh, I wish there's something that can disseminate this information to my group so I don't have to repeat it again. Think about the KPIs and other metrics that you keep track of, and how can you get a nice significant jump. So think of the problem space, and then don't be afraid of AI. It's going to be your friend in the future. So befriend AI now, because it's really a two-way street kind of relationship. We're training the AI by interacting with it. We're actually giving it a lot of data. It's literally food for thought in AI, like, kind of way of thinking. And the other way is also true. We're adapting our behaviors to like think of like, how can I work with the machine to be more productive? How can I make sure that I'm including the AI in my meetings, for example, or in my contact center, so that it gives me this access to the possible scenarios that I never thought were possible before. And much more succinct way, just do it.